James Kirkland never liked sleeping. It wasn't the comfort that bothered him. It was the dreams. Lately they were worse. Much worse. The name echoed in the black spaces behind his eyelids. Freddy. Just a whisper at first, then louder, a raspy voice, promising terror. James would wake up, heart pounding, sheets twisted around him like a straitjacket. He tried to tell himself it was all in his head. Stress, overwork, that horror movie marathon with Michael. But deep down, he knew better. This was something different, something ancient and evil. One night he woke up with a gasp, the sheets soaked in sweat. The air in his room felt heavy, oppressive. He stumbled out of bed, his legs shaky, and fumbled for the light switch. The nightmare had followed him into the waking world. He needed help. He needed someone to believe him. The nightmare started simply. Oppressive heat, the stench of mildew and rust. James found himself standing in a dimly lit room. Pipes lined the walls, hissing and groaning like living things. In the distance, a furnace roared, casting flickering light on the grimy concrete floor. The figure stepped into the light, and James felt a scream catch in his throat. Freddy Krueger. His face, a grotesque mask of burned flesh, was stretched into a mocking grin. His eyes, two burning embers, seemed to bore into James's soul. The fedora, the red and green striped sweater, the glove with its razor-sharp blades, it was all there. This wasn't a dream. This was real, and Freddy was here for him. Freddy lunged, his laughter echoing through the boiler room. James squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the searing pain of the blades. But it never came. He opened his eyes to find himself lying in his bed, his sheets twisted around him. The room was bathed in the pale light of dawn, but the nightmare clung to him like a shroud. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It had been just a dream, a nightmare. But it felt so real. And Freddy. God, Freddy. The diner was their usual spot. James sat across from Michael, his breakfast untouched. He'd recounted the nightmare, every terrifying detail. Michael listened patiently, his brow furrowed, a skeptical frown on his face. Freddy Krueger? Michael finally asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Come on, James, that's just a character from a movie. It's not just a movie, Mike, James insisted, his voice rising in desperation. He's real, he's in my dreams, he knows my name. Michael caught up to James outside the diner, his hand gripping his friend's shoulder. James, wait, he said, his voice urgent. I'm sorry, okay? I should have listened. You're not crazy, I believe you. Relief, sharp and sudden, washed over James. What do we do? James asked, his voice raw with desperation. Michael shook his head, his expression grim. I don't know, man, he admitted, but we'll figure it out. A new resolve settled over James. He wasn't sure what they could do, but he refused to face this nightmare alone. One evening, James woke from a particularly vivid nightmare, his heart pounding, his body slick with sweat. Freddy's laughter still echoed in his ears. He reached for his phone, needing to hear Michael's voice, but the phone wasn't on his nightstand. In fact, the entire apartment felt different, colder, the air thick with a suffocating dread. Panic surged through him. He scrambled out of bed, his bare feet slapping against the cold floor. Michael? He called out, his voice hoarse with fear. The note fluttered to the floor, a white flag surrendering to the encroaching darkness. James stood frozen, the blood in his veins turning to ice. His gaze darted around the room, searching for any sign of Michael. The silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic thumping of his own heart. His friend was gone, snatched away by the nightmare he had tried so desperately to warn him about. He picked up the note again, his fingers trembling as he reread the chilling words. Come find me. Let's play. Freddy was mocking him, taunting him with Michael's life. The streets were deserted, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. The air was heavy with a cold, damp mist that clung to James's skin like a shroud. Every creak, every groan of the city around him sent shivers down his spine. The line between reality and nightmare was blurring. He walked for what felt like hours, his mind replaying every terrifying detail of his nightmares. The laughter, the mocking tone, the promise of pain. It echoed in his ears, driving him forward, deeper into the heart of the nightmare. He had to find Michael. He had to stop Freddy. But a terrible thought was beginning to take root in his mind. What if he was already too late? The boiler room loomed before him, a dark, hulking shape against the gray sky. The metal door creaked open with a groan that seemed to reverberate through James's bones. The stench hit him first, a wave of stale air, rust, and something sickly sweet that made his stomach churn. The air was thick with steam, obscuring the room in a hazy, dreamlike quality. The furnace roared in the distance, casting flickering shadows that danced on the grimy walls. It was the same as his nightmares. Every detail burned into his memory, every sensation amplified by terror. "Michael?" he called out, his voice a desperate croak in the oppressive silence. "Michael, are you here?" Only the echo of his own voice answered him. The sound seemed to mock him, to taunt him with the emptiness of the room. He stepped inside, his hand gripping the pocket knife in his pocket, his heart pounding against his ribs. The door slammed shut behind him with a resounding clang that seemed to seal his fate. "Looking for someone, James?" The voice slithered through the air, a chilling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. James spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, his eyes searching frantically for the source of the voice. He saw nothing but the swirling steam and the flickering shadows cast by the furnace. "Show yourself, Freddy!" James shouted, his voice echoing through the vast empty space. "You took Michael. What have you done with him?" A low chuckle echoed around him, chilling him to the bone. "Always so serious, James," Freddy's voice purred, closer now, right behind him. "We're here to play a game, remember?" James whirled around, his hand whipping out the pocket knife, his breath catching in his throat. Freddy stood before him, his grin a grotesque mockery of human expression, his eyes burning like hot coals in the dim light. He was real. The nightmares, the fear, it was all real. And now, he was trapped. "Where's Michael?" James demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "Let him go, Freddy. This has nothing to do with him." Freddy tilted his head, his grin widening. "Oh, but it does, James," he crooned, taking a step closer. "He knows your secret now. He knows about me. And now," he added, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "he's going to pay the price." James lunged, his fear giving way to a desperate surge of adrenaline. He had to stop Freddy. He had to save Michael, even if it was the last thing he ever did. The pocket knife felt cold and insignificant in his hand, a child's toy against the monstrous reality before him. Freddy simply watched him, a dark amusement glinting in his eyes, as if James were a fly buzzing around his head, an annoyance rather than a threat. He made no move to attack, but the air crackled with a malevolent energy that made James's skin crawl. "You think that can hurt me?" Freddy chuckled, the sound like nails scraping against bone. "You're still clinging to the waking world, James. Here, in my world, the rules are different." He snapped his fingers, and the boiler room around them seemed to dissolve, the grimy walls melting away like wax. James stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror as his surroundings shifted and reformed. He was no longer in the boiler room. He was in a place out of his darkest nightmares, a twisted, surreal landscape bathed in a sickly green light. Jagged metal structures reached for the sky like skeletal fingers, and the air hummed with a low, ominous drone that vibrated in James's bones. The ground beneath his feet was cold and slick, covered in a viscous black ooze that smelled of decay and death. And in the center of it all, impaled on a jagged metal hook, was Michael. His friend hung limply, his clothes torn and bloodied, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were closed, but even from a distance, James could see the raw terror etched on his features. Michael! James screamed, his voice raw with anguish. He stumbled towards his friend, his heart breaking at the sight of his broken body. He reached out, desperate to touch him, to make sure he was still alive. But Freddy's laughter stopped him cold. "Don't worry, James," Freddy purred, his voice a sickeningly sweet caress. "He's not dead. Not yet. But the longer you take, the less of him there will be to save." He gestured to the landscape around them, his grin widening. "Welcome to my world, James. A world where fear is my playground, and you are the plaything." The ground beneath James's feet shifted, the black ooze bubbling and churning as metal bars rose from the depths, forming a cage around him. He rattled the bars, his heart pounding in his chest, but they were cold and unyielding. He was trapped, a rat in a cage, at the mercy of a monster. "Let him go, Freddy!" James roared, his voice hoarse with desperation. "This has nothing to do with him! It's me you want!" Freddy circled the cage, his movements fluid and predatory, his eyes never leaving James. "Oh, but it has everything to do with him," he crooned. "He's your weakness, James, your Achilles heel, and I always aim for the heart." He reached out a clawed hand, his touch sending a jolt of pure terror through James's body. "But don't worry," he whispered, his voice a sibilant hiss. "I haven't forgotten about you. You'll get your turn, right after I've had my fun with your friend." Freddy snapped his fingers again, and the ground before the cage began to shift and change. Metal platforms rose from the ooze, connected by rickety bridges that swayed precariously over chasms of darkness. Spikes protruded from the walls, and blades whirred to life with a high-pitched whine, their edges glinting menacingly in the green light. It was a gauntlet, designed to test his courage and break his spirit. "Here's the deal, James," Freddy said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You want to save your friend? Get to the other side of this little obstacle course, and he's all yours. But be warned, one misstep, and it's all over. For both of you." He gestured to the cage, his grin widening. "Of course, you could always stay here and watch. I'm sure he'd appreciate the company." James didn't hesitate. He didn't care about the danger, didn't care about the fear that clawed at the edges of his sanity. He had to save Michael. He had to try. With a surge of adrenaline, James charged towards the edge of the cage, his eyes fixed on the gauntlet beyond. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was a game he couldn't win. But he would be damned if he didn't fight with everything he had. Each step on the metal platforms felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. The air hummed with the threat of the spinning blades, their sharp edges a constant reminder of the price of failure. But James pushed forward, his gaze fixed on Michael's broken form in the distance. Each clang of metal against metal, each creak of the rickety bridges sent shivers down his spine, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. Freddy's laughter echoed around him, a mocking counterpoint to the frantic beating of his own heart. He leaped across chasms, adrenaline fueling his every move, his breath catching in his throat as he narrowly avoided the spikes that jutted from the walls. The air grew thick with the metallic tang of blood. His own or Michael's, he couldn't tell. The gauntlet seemed to stretch on forever, a twisted labyrinth designed to break his spirit. But the thought of Michael, hanging helpless and alone, fueled his determination. He could hear Freddy's voice now, a sibilant whisper in his ear, taunting him, urging him to give up, to succumb to the fear that threatened to consume him. But James clung to the sliver of hope that remained, the desperate belief that he could save his friend, that he could escape this nightmare. He had to try. For Michael. For himself. As he reached the final platform, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The ground seemed to tilt beneath his feet, the air growing thin and cold. He could see the edge of the gauntlet now, the promise of freedom just beyond. But between him and Michael stood Freddy, his grin a grotesque mask of triumph, his gloved hand raised, the blades glinting menacingly in the green light. James closed his eyes, bracing for the impact, for the searing pain of the blades, but it never came. He opened his eyes to find himself lying on the cold, hard floor of the boiler room. The furnace roared in the distance, casting flickering shadows that danced on the grimy walls. The air was thick with the stench of rust and decay. But the surreal, nightmarish landscape was gone. So was Michael. The boiler room was empty, the silence deafening. He was alone. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion? He didn't know. Michael was gone, and a part of him knew, with chilling certainty, that he was never coming back. James Kirkland walked away from the boiler room that day, a changed man. He carried the scar of that night etched deep within him, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked at the edges of reality. Forever tormented by Freddy's laughter, forever haunted by the chilling truth.